I want to bring in Wolfgang Koester. He's a Senior Strategy Officer at Kyriba. Wolfgang, you've got a lot in your notes, and it seems you're focused on what companies are doing based on the U.S. dollar. I want to start kind of from the macro perspective here. It's been one of the more reliable bearish trends in this market. Is there anything in your mind that could keep the dollar from continuing its descent?
Well, I'm actually more worried about how companies are managing the volatility. So, perfect example today. All of a sudden, you got a strong move in the currency of the dollar, and it's immediately decreasing again. So and I'm sure we'll talk about Airbnb, when you look at companies and try to understand the most important part of that company, aside from their product, is liquidity. And volatility is what hurts them. You said it in the prior segment with Eva in there, where you talked about, well, what happens if it's stable? I think your point there was actually very correct. If you have a stable dollar, that's best for every investor, unless you have companies who actually know how to manage that currency risk, and they all can. There are many of them who can and will do it.
So the volatility, when you describe volatility, what do you mean by that? I mean, the dollar has just been so reliably southward that it seems the volatility is basically only for anyone who's not short this thing.
Well, if you look at straight lines, if you look at like the first day of the quarter and the last day of the quarter, which is not the way that corporations manage, because they don't have an accounts receivable on January 1 and they still have it on March 31st. Somewhere in between, they buy it and they sell it. So these ups and downs and these volatilities, as you're showing it right there with volatility now coming off, we expect that to actually come back up, is what's really hurting these companies. For right now, the United States dollar being weak is good for U.S. companies who have a lot of their revenues abroad, because the value of those currencies, euros, for example, being up, they get more money, therefore their number goes up. But what really your investors are looking for is, how is a corporation managing that? Because there'll be times when you have a strong dollar, which will be bad for companies, and then there'll be times when there is a weak dollar, which is great for at least for U.S. companies. Now, you had for the last two investors that you had on there, investor advisors on there, you talked about not just U.S. stocks, you got to think about your global portfolio. And so the companies that are going to do well are the companies who know how to manage not only that risk, but overall liquidity. Do they have visibility to their liquidity? Do they have ways to move that liquidity, to protect that liquidity, and to optimize it? The SMPO of liquidity is crucial for companies, and there's never been a more crucial time than right now.
So, Wolfgang, for investors, when they understand the impact on this, you give an example. Grainger just lost a basis point of its revenues due to currency volatility in the recent reports. Anheuser-Busch, on the other hand, lost 7% of its revenue to currency volatility. So how much of this is about just the size of the cash pile in general, where if the dollar is decreasing in value, you're exposed with a big cash pile? Does that mean we should be wary investors of buying into companies that aren't putting their cash to work in some way if it's just going to get devalued?
No, this is actually about revenues. This is about top line. So you literally are managing, if you look at Grainger, obviously they're about 1/10 the company of Anheuser-Busch, but like you said, in percentages, they have 10 basis points, which is nothing, in relatively international portfolio of building engines. Then on the other hand, you have an Anheuser-Busch who all of a sudden loses $1.6 billion on the top line. Think about how many jobs that creates. That is very manageable. They're just not managing it, whereas Grainger's managing very well. So from an investor point of view, you got to look at who, as we talked about earlier, who's managing that risk well and who's not. In those two cases that you just brought up, Anheuser-Busch, my opinion, not doing a great job on managing that, which is an indication on liquidity. On the other hand, you've got a Grainger, doing a Fortune 500 company, doing a great job.
Now, how does one go about figuring this out? If you're just an everyday investor, and your point here is that this makes a big deal for these companies, top and bottom line. How do you find this out? How do you know? What are the indicators that you look for? How do you find metrics on how a company is managing their currency risk?
Yeah, so first of all, what you do is you look at the foreign exchange gain or loss line under EBITDA, so going into the net income. That's the first indicator. The second thing you do is you look into the item 3 of the quarterly report, the 10Q. It describes it, has to describe it there. And then the annual report in item 7A, again, there they have to describe what they're doing or not. when we looked at Airbnb, the one only cautious thing that we looked at when Airbnb was ready to go public is the report lists 69 times currencies as a risk and a potential impact for the future value. That's a large number. And when you think about that, over 50% of their revenues come from outside the United States, as well as expenses. It's an issue. They know it. They need to address it. They'll have to address it better because they need to know how to manage their liquidity.